Today we'll be discussing the third chapter of Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, the question of the essence of being. By the conclusion of the last chapter, Heidegger has arrived at the point where we can see quite clearly that the linguistic examination of being, understanding being through the word being, and understanding the word through a grammatical and etymological analysis is not going to get us where we want to go. It's not going to provide us with an understanding of the essence of being. So Heidegger starts over in this third chapter to re-examine once again this question. And it's going to turn out that ultimately he will not abandon the approach that relies upon language as the clue or the key to the essence of being. But this conception of language, or this approach through language, is no longer going to be linguistic in the sense of grammatical or etymological. Rather, it's going to be an approach to language that is more primordial, more philosophical, and that intertwines being with language in a more fundamental way than is typically conceived in either the linguistic or the philosophical tradition. Heidegger notes to begin that the attempt to grasp being through the word being has only led to a re-emphasis upon its elusiveness and the evanescence of the meaning of being. This naturally leads us to wonder whether it wouldn't be better to seek being among particular beings. On page 83, he gives voice to this impulse. Away from the empty universal word being toward the special characteristics of the particular domains of beings themselves. For this project, we have all sorts of things immediately at our disposal. The things that we can grasp with our hands right away, all the equipment that is at hand for us all the time, tools, vehicles, etc. If these particular beings strike us as too ordinary, not refined and soulful enough for metaphysics, then we can stick to the nature that surrounds us, land, sea, mountains, rivers, forests, and the individual things in them, trees, birds, and insects, grasses, and stones. If we are looking for a mighty being, then the earth is nearby. In the same way as the nearest mountaintop is in being, so is the moon rising behind it, or a planet. In being is the surging swarm of people on an animated street. In being are we ourselves. In being are the Japanese. In being are Bach's fugues. In being is the Cathedral of Strasbourg. In being are Hölderlin's hymns. In being are criminals. In being are the madmen in a madhouse. Beings everywhere and anytime you like. So we have no problem finding beings. Let's look at them in order to understand being. But then he raises a puzzle. Without a doubt, we know that all these beings just mentioned are. Or with a different emphasis, we can say that we know that all these beings are. However, that does not explain how we know that they are. That is, how we know that there are beings in the first place. Now, ordinarily, this puzzle doesn't trouble us, not even as a puzzle. We just let beings be. We're not puzzled by them. We just let them be, all of these things that were mentioned. The very fact that we're able to do this, however, shows that we must know what we mean when we say that something is. At the very least, we must be able to distinguish between being and non-being, somehow, in some way. The new conclusion, then, that Heidegger draws is that we must know the meaning of being because we use it every day in countless situations. This new conclusion, though, we must know the meaning of being, seems to contradict the conclusion of previous examination, that being is an empty and indefinite word. Heidegger frames the problem in this way. on page 85, in the middle of the page. Such reflections put us in a supremely ambivalent position. We first determined that the word being tells us nothing definite. We did not just talk ourselves into this. Instead, we found out, and we still find now, that being has an evanescent, indefinite meaning. But on the other hand, our latest considerations convince us that we clearly and surely distinguish being from non-being. So it seems that the word being is indefinite and definite at the same time. Or perhaps it's better to say that it's indefinite in its meaning, and yet we definitely understand it, or we understand it definitely when we make everyday judgments, like the judgment that the window over there is closed or is not closed, or the cat is on the chair, or the cat is not on the couch. We don't regard these as indefinite claims or judgments. They seem as definite as anything can be, but yet they rely on our being able to distinguish being from non-being. And being, we've said, is something that is indefinite, that is evanescent in its meaning. So is there a way to make sense of this apparent contradiction between the indefiniteness of being that Heidegger has been talking about up to now and this new definiteness that being seems to have when we make these everyday judgments? Heidegger thinks that if we meditate upon this apparent contradiction, it will cause us to question the belief in the supposed emptiness of the word being. The word, it turns out, is not empty so much as it is unique. This word is not like other words. Heidegger explains towards the last paragraph of page 86. Everything else besides being, each and every being, even if it is unique, can still be compared with another being. These possibilities of comparison increase every being's determinability. Because of this, every being is multiply indeterminate. But being, in contrast, can be compared to nothing else. Its only other is nothing. And here there is nothing to be compared. If being is thus what is most unique and most determinate, then the expression to be cannot remain empty either. So beings become more determinate by comparing them with other beings. And he also mentions the multiple indeterminacy of every being. Every being is multiply indeterminate as well as being indeterminate, being determinable, meaning that I take it that you can always further determine a being by comparing it to something else, refining your comparisons and so forth. So, you could talk about it, pick anything, take the favorite example of a glass, right? You can talk about how this glass compares to glasses of other shapes and sizes and so on. You can classify them. But you could always further determine this by comparing it to other things. You could talk about the distinction between a glass and a mug, right? You could talk about the distinction between a glass and a bowl or a jar. What's the distinction between a mason jar and a glass? Is a mason jar a glass? For some people it is, right? Moonshiners especially. So, it's always going to be multiply indeterminate, and further determinable. But being is not something that you can compare to other beings in this way so as to determine it. It's not determinable in the way that beings are, because it's incomparable. You can't make it more determinate by comparing it with other beings, not even God. Even God you can compare with other things in order to make it determinate in the sense of comparing conceptions of God, perhaps with other conceptions of God. If you ask, how would you explain to someone what a pantheistic conception of God is, which we talked about in the context of interpreting Spinoza's ethics, how would you compare pantheistic conception of God with the God of traditional theism? And you could compare them, and in comparing them, make them more determinate, saying, well, we have this distinction between what's immanent to the material universe and what's transcendent, and the traditional conception of God says it's transcendent, whereas the pantheistic conception says it's immanent. So there you're making a comparison of sort of two gods, as it were, right, or two conceptions of God. But being is unique in the sense that it's literally incomparable. Of course, you can say, well, being is, you can compare and contrast it with nothing, the nothing, but that sounds like you're basically just reemphasizing the point that it's incomparable. You can't compare it with anything. You can compare it with nothing. So in the ordinary way, then, it can't be made determinate. Being is totally indeterminate because it is literally beyond compare. However, at the same time, being is the most determinate in the sense that we always seem to know when to say is and is not about given things. That is, well, we might be uncertain in specific cases whether something is or is not. We never question the meaningfulness of the word is itself. Thus, the universal concept being is not empty either. Heidegger observes that it retains its naming power. To illustrate the uniqueness of the universal concept being, Heidegger compares it to an everyday universal concept, the representation, as he calls it, of tree. So let's take a look at that. This is on page 87 through 88. He says, second paragraph, instead of the universal concept being, we will consider as an example the universal representation tree. If we are now to say and define what the essence of a tree is, we turn away from the universal representation to the various species of trees and individual examples of these species. This procedure is so self-evident that we are almost embarrassed to make special mention of it. However, the matter is not quite that simple. How are we supposed to discover the much invoked particular, the individual trees as such, as trees? How are we supposed to even look for such things as trees, unless the representation of what a tree is in general is already lighting our way in advance? If this universal representation tree were so completely indefinite and confused, if it gave us no sure directive in our searching and finding, it could happen that instead of trees, we took cars or rabbits as the indeterminate particulars, as examples of a tree. Even though it may be correct that in order to determine more precisely the essential multiplicity of the essence tree, we must go through the particular, it remains at least equally correct that the illumination of the essential multiplicity and the essence takes hold and progresses only when we conceive and know more originally the universal essence tree. And this then means the essence plant, and this means the essence living thing and life. We may seek out thousands and thousands of trees, but if the self-developing knowledge of the tree as such does not light our way in advance of this enterprise, and does not clearly determine itself on the basis of itself and its essential ground, then all this will remain an idle enterprise in which we cannot see the tree from the trees. Heidegger actually allows himself a rare witticism there. So what's going on here? There's a couple of stages that he's going through here. Once again, Heidegger is following out this procedure of sort of giving voice to a commonplace belief only in order to show its superficiality and its thoughtlessness and to arrive at a deeper conception. So the initial question in this passage is, how do we define tree? It's commonly believed by empiricists that we don't look to the universal representation, but rather to the various species of trees and individual examples, especially of what a tree is. However, to do this, it's obvious that we need to know how to recognize and pick out the trees from the various other sorts of things that we encounter in our everyday experience. But how are we supposed to be able to do that if the representation of tree, the general representation, is not yet, as it were, lighting our way? Right? Remember, we're presupposing here that we're first arriving at the definition of tree. We don't yet have it. We don't yet have a general representation. So it can't be lighting our way. We have to somehow grope around in the dark, so to speak, among individual objects and pick out the trees without having a general idea of what a tree is. How are we supposed to do that? There's nothing to provide us with any way of distinguishing a tree from, say, a bush or a rock outcropping. And so Heidegger says we define tree rather from its universal essence, which requires us to subsume it as a species under a higher genera, under plant, and plant is then subsumed under living thing, and living thing is subsumed under life. This should be familiar to us from our reading and understanding of Aristotle's method of constructing definitions and defining essences of things, namely by placing a particular object and its species under broader genera. Now, back to being then, Heidegger is going to ask, if we try to define being in this way, we immediately run into a problem. It seems that we can't subsume being under any higher genera using the Aristotelian method of defining things and therefore circumscribing their essence. We can't subsume being under any higher genera because it's the highest genus on this way of thinking. This suggests that the only representational content that being has must come from what falls under it. However, Heidegger rejects this suggestion for two reasons. First, it's questionable whether being is, in fact, a genus at all, highest or not. That would need to be established. Heidegger doesn't provide an argument against it, per se, but he just points out to the fact that we can't assume either that being is just a genus. Second, being is not a universal name, since the name and what it names are one of a kind. Hence, we distort it when we try to use examples as if it were a name that several separate things could have in common. So being is not a genus, at least it hasn't been shown that it's a genus, and it's not a name. So it seems that we can't define being by subsuming it under a higher genus, not only because there arguably is no higher genus, but also because it seems questionable that being itself is even a genus in the first place. Yet it remains the case that, like tree, we have to have some sort of implicit knowledge, at least of the universal, in order to be able to recognize and pick out the particular. Just as we have to have some implicit understanding of tree in order to pick out the trees, so too do we have to have some implicit understanding of being, it would seem, in order to pick out beings. What's the solution? Heidegger says, this is on page 89, that we must, quote, raise the uniqueness of this name and its naming to the level of knowledge. We must raise the uniqueness of this name and its naming to the level of knowledge. We have to embrace the priority, the universality, and the uniqueness of being all at once and examine what is named in this name in its own terms. And this for Heidegger means that we have to presuppose it as a fact that we still understand being and distinguish it with certainty from non-being. So this is the big fact that we cannot avoid. We still understand being. And distinguish it with certainty from non-being. So this fact is going to serve as the platform or the launching pad from which Heidegger is going to pursue the later investigations of this chapter. We still understand being. The understanding of being has to be taken as a fact. Now, Heidegger doesn't exactly just assert this fact. He actually argues for it on pages 89 and 90 in our text. We could summarize the argument this way. First, if there were no indeterminate meaning of being, and we did not understand what this meaning signifies, so that is to say, if we deny this fact and claim that we don't understand what being signifies, then we could not understand beings as such at all. So if there were no indeterminate meaning of being and we did not understand what this meaning signifies, then we could not understand beings as such at all. Second, if we did not understand beings as such at all, then there would not be language at all. There would not be language at all, for beings could not be addressed and discussed. And Heidegger elaborates on these ideas on page 90 at the top. Presuming that we did not understand being at all, presuming that the word being did not even have that evanescent meaning, then there would not be any single word at all. We ourselves could never be those who say. We would never be able to be those who are. For to be human means to be a sayer. Human beings are yes and no sayers only because they are, in the ground of their essence, sayers, the sayers. That is their distinction and also their predicament. It distinguishes them from stones, plants, and animals, but also from the gods. Even if we had 1,000 eyes and 1,000 ears, 1,000 hands, and many other senses and organs, if our essence did not stand within the power of language, then all beings would remain closed off to us, the beings that we ourselves are, no less than the beings that we are not. So some key takeaways here. An understanding of being is a condition of saying. An understanding of being is a condition of saying. Saying is a condition of being the distinctive kind of being we are, namely a human being. Our essence stands in the power of language, whatever exactly that means. And if this were not the case, then all beings would be closed to us, including our own being. Including our own being would be closed to us if we do not stand in the power of language. So this leads to our first discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger's claims that, 1, an understanding of being is a condition of saying, and 2, saying is a condition of being the distinctive kind of being we are, a human being? Is Heidegger really claiming that being is closed to creatures like a dog or a cat who lack the power of saying? What do you think he means by this? And if so, if he's saying this, is he right about this? So first discussion question, do you agree with Heidegger's claims that an understanding of being is a condition of saying, and saying is a condition of being the distinctive kind of being we are, a human being? Is Heidegger really claiming that being is closed to creatures like a dog or a cat who lack the power of saying? What do you think he means by this, and do you think he's right about this? Well, we can speak of the fact that we understand being, that is to say, this fact, which, keep in mind, doesn't imply that we have a definite understanding of being. It just says we can understand being, but Heidegger will emphasize that typically this is an indefinite understanding. So while we can speak of the fact that we understand being, this language of fact is really something of a misnomer, because our understanding of being is, strictly speaking, not really a fact at all. So let's put some scare quotes in there to let us know that this isn't really a fact, technically speaking. The relationship between being and facts does not really allow for this to be a fact, for our understanding of being to be a fact. Because our understanding of being is not really a fact at all, but rather something far higher than all facts. We do not relate to our indefinite understanding of being in the straightforward way in which we relate to a fact. A fact is merely something to be accepted as such and dealt with, perhaps by repressing it, but dealt with nonetheless. Right? It is a fact that I need to drink water right now or I'm going to cough. Right? Maybe I somehow know that there's something wrong with my body, but because it's due to fear of having a dangerous disease or something, I'm ignoring it or repressing that fact, right? But either way, the fact is just something to be accepted or not, accepted or repressed. An understanding of being is not just accepted like this, nor is it repressed. Rather, what an understanding of being does is it fades into a kind of indefiniteness, concealment, confusion, or darkness, obscurity. It's not repressed. But even more deeply than this, being is the ground of facts. And not only of facts, but it's the ground of our own Dasein. So Heidegger explains this on page 92. He says, towards the top there, why may we no longer call what we have just mentioned a fact? Why was this designation misleading from the start? Because this, that we understand being, does not just occur in our Dasein, like the fact, say, that we possess earlobes of such and such a sort. Instead of earlobes, some other structure could form part of our hearing organ. That we understand being is not just actual, it is also necessary. Without such an opening up of being, we could not be human in the first place. And skipping down there to the last dozen lines on the page. But if human beings stand in Dasein, then one necessary condition for our ability to be here, Dasein, is this, that we understand being. In other words, the opening up of being, which occurs in our understanding of being, however indefinite this may be, is the condition of the possibility of our own being. This gives the understanding of being that we mentioned here a more fundamental metaphysical status and a higher rank than any mere fact. So that we understand being isn't really, strictly speaking, literally a fact. We acknowledge the higher status and the indefinite status of the understanding of being by drawing being out of obscurity through questioning. We relate to being and our understanding of being not as just something to be accepted or repressed like a fact, but through questioning. And this is a kind of deeper relationship and one that acknowledges tacitly a higher status to being, as Heidegger sees it. Going back to page 91 here, he says, third paragraph, questioning is the genuine and the right and the only way of deeming worthy that which by its highest rank holds our Dasein in its power. This understanding of being of ours, and being itself altogether, is therefore what is most worthy of questioning in all questioning. we question all the more genuinely, the more immediately and directly we hold on to what is most worthy of questioning, namely, that for us being is what we understand in a completely indefinite and yet supremely definite way. Philosophical questioning for Heidegger is a happening, an event that emerges through steps, through the particular steps that the questioner must undertake him or herself. So he continues, we understand the word being and hence all its inflections, even though it looks as if this understanding were indefinite. We say of what we thus understand, of whatever opens itself up to us somehow in understanding, that it has meaning or sense. Being, insofar as it is understood at all, has a meaning. To experience and conceive of being as what is most worthy of questioning, to inquire especially about being, then means nothing other than asking about the meaning of being. Recall that the conclusion of the last chapter was that we could not use grammar and etymology to approach the word being and expect thereby to clarify our indeterminate understanding or analysis of being. Nevertheless, there is for Heidegger an essential link between being and the word, between being itself and the word being. We simply can't use grammar and etymology to reveal it, but there still is this essential connection between being and the word, an essential link. To see what this essential link is, we need to explore more generally the nature of language, the essence of language. In this exploration, Heidegger begins with the assumed link, the ordinary everyday assumption, that is, that there is a link between language and experience. So on page 95, second paragraph, language, the word, is ordinarily taken as a derivative and incidental expression of experiences. Insofar as things and processes are experienced in these experiences, language is also indirectly an expression and, as it were, a reproduction of the experienced being. And then he goes on to talk about the way in which this is typically broken down. So, a word is standardly analyzed into three parts. First, there's the visible and audible form of the word. Second, there is the meaning, or the sense of what one generally represents to oneself. With that word form. And then third, there's the thing that the word refers to, or the referent. So those are the parts of the word, the form, and then what we might describe as the content. But the content has two parts. There's the sense, or the meaning of what is normally expressed by that word form, and then there's the thing that it refers to, which we're conceiving here of the thing, sort of the thing qua the meaning that is part of the content of the word. I think that's the only way to make sense of the idea that this third part is also part of the word, as if it's part of the meaning content in a broader sense of the word. So when I point to glass, and I'd say the word glass contains this reference to the thing. And the relationship between these is something like this, that we say that the first here is the sign for the second, which indicates the third. So the word form is the sign for the representation of the sense of the thing, and that's what I use to refer to the thing. That gives the word empirical content. Heidegger draws the conclusion from this kind of analysis that the point of the word is to come to the thing, as Heidegger puts it, to come to the thing, to bring us to the thing. The word form and the mental representation of the sense that I attach to that word form aims at indicating the thing, to bring us to the thing. To get beyond the level of meanings and get the thing, get at the thing. That's the point of the word, to get at the thing, to come to the thing. But dwelling on these first two parts, the word form and the meaning that's represented, will not all by itself bring us to the thing. No explication of the word form and the meaning that one generally represents to oneself via the word form will bring us to the thing. Heidegger compares this to the procedure of attempting to do physics by giving grammatical explications of, I think he mentions atoms and the ether, but we'll update this. Let's say, I'm going to attempt to do physics by giving you the grammar of boson and fermion. Right? There's a lot that can be, not a lot, but there's, things that can be said about the grammar of boson and fermion, the etymology certainly, right? You could talk about the scientists that these particles are named after. But that's not doing physics, right? That's at best doing maybe history of physics. So that's Heidegger's point, is that doing a grammatical and etymological analysis of the word form and the meaning that you attach to it isn't going to bring you to the thing. But the thing actually doesn't get us to being either. For being is not a thing. Being is not a thing like a clock, a house, or a boson or fermion. Being is not a being. And this, of course, is a familiar point by now. And Heidegger even acknowledges that. So there's no thing that corresponds to the word being. So if that's the case, then on this analysis, the meaning of a word does not constitute the essence of being. The meaning of a word in this sense, or on this understanding, is not going to constitute the essence of a being for the fundamental reason. I mean, there's, of course, the preliminary reason that you don't get to the thing by just looking at these first two elements. But also, even if you did, being is not a thing. If we ask about the being of a being, for example, the being of a building, this does not consist in the meaning of a word, Heidegger says. So Heidegger summarizes the key conclusion from reflections like this at the bottom of page 96. And you know this is important because it's in italics. He says, the word being, in every one of its inflections, relates to what is said in it, being itself, in a way that is essentially different from the relation of all other nouns and verbs in language to the beings that are said in them. The word being, in every one of its inflections, that is, whether we're saying is, are, was, has been, etc., right? In every one of its inflections, relates to what is said in it, being itself, in a way that is essentially different from the relation of all other nouns and verbs in language to the beings that are said in them. Okay, this brings us to a second discussion question. How can there be an essential link between being and the word being if the essence of being itself, not the word, but being itself, does not consist of the meaning of the word? What do you think is the more original bond that ties the words for being, or being in its various inflections, to what is meant by it? What about the essence of language itself? How, if at all, is this essence determined by being? So the second discussion question, how can there be an essential link between being and the word being if the essence of being does not consist of the meaning of the word? What do you think is the more original bond that ties the word being to what is meant by it? How is the essence of language itself determined by being, if it is at all? Okay. How does the word being relate to being? How does the word being relate to being? This is still our question. Being is said in the word being. That much we can say, but what does this mean? To answer this question, Heidegger returns to the ways in which being itself is said. So on page 97, he says, third paragraph, he gives us a bunch of examples of the way in which being is said. We say, God is, the earth is, the lecture is in the auditorium. That man is from Swabia. The cup is of silver. The peasant is in the fields. The book is mine. He is dead. Red is the port side. In Russia there is famine. The enemy is in retreat. The vine disease is in the vineyards. The dog is in the garden. Over all the peaks is peace. This last one is a line of poetry from Goethe. Over all the peaks is peace. Heidegger notes, first of all, that the overall impression that's left by such a list is one of the manifoldness of the ways of saying being. Out of this, we get an impression of the manifold senses of being. Heidegger lists the different senses of the different uses he gave before on the next page, or at the bottom of this one and in the next one. So, God is in the sense of being actually present. God is, and by that we mean actually present. The earth is, i.e., we experience and believe it to be constantly present at hand. The lecture is in the auditorium. What about that one? How do we understand that? Heidegger says, it takes place. It takes place. The man is from Swabia. What does the is mean here? It means he comes from there. The cup is of silver, means it consists of. The peasant is in the fields, i.e., he has moved to the fields. He is staying there. The book is mine. It belongs to me. He is dead, i.e., he has succumbed to death. Red is the port side, i.e., it stands for. The dog is in the garden, i.e., it is running around there. And Heidegger notes that the final example, the poetic line from Goethe, is not so easy to characterize as the others. But he doesn't make too much of that fact here, although he will elsewhere, about the special status of poetic language. Here he merely draws the apparent conclusion that being opens up to us in a manifold way. Being opens up to us in a manifold way. And if this is true, then it's simply false to say that being is an empty term. Now, Heidegger recognizes that one might object to the inference that these examples of is really do show that being opens up in a manifold way. For we might ask, are the manifold ways due to the is itself as it's used in these various expressions we just went over? Is it due to the is itself, the manifoldness? Or rather, is just an empty expression, and the manifold ways are not due to it, but rather to the differences in the context in which is used. So, page 99, he says, middle of the first paragraph, giving voice to this objection, he says, it is only because the is in itself remains indeterminate and empty in its meaning that it can lie ready for such a manifold use and can fill and determine itself according to the situation. The manifoldness of determinate meanings we have cited thus proves the opposite of what we are trying to show. It just proves as clearly as possible that being must be indeterminate in order to be susceptible to determination. But he replies to this by saying that the decisive question is this: does the is become manifold on the basis of the content of the sentence that is attached to it in each case, i.e. on the basis of the domain of that about which sentences are making assertions? So that's the one option. Is the manifoldness due to the content of the sentence, that is to say, the basis of the domain about which the sentences are making assertions? Or does the is, i.e. being, contain in itself the manifoldness whose folding makes it possible for us to make manifold beings accessible to ourselves in the first place, each as it is? For now, let this question simply be posed. So he acknowledges that this is the deciding question. Is the manifoldness that we see attached to this expression is a manifoldness that is, as it were, folded into the expression itself and that enables us to see things in manifold ways, relate to them in manifold ways? Or is it rather this is just an empty expression that can be attached to anything and everything, and that the manifoldness really exists outside of the is itself? Unfortunately, at this point, it seems that Heidegger thinks with the tools presently at our disposal, we don't have the ability to answer this question, to say which it is. Still, there is no arbitrariness in the manifold of meanings. That is to say, there is some common thread or original core meaning. And Heidegger calls this a definite unitary trait that holds these manifold meanings together. This is on page 100. Where he refers to the definite unitary trait in the towards the end of the first paragraph there. He says, it points our understanding of to be toward a definite horizon by which the understanding is fulfilled. The boundary drawn around the sense of being stays within the sphere of presentness and presence, persistence and subsistence, staying and coming forth, which he says this is the Greek understanding of being as present. So the claim is that all of these different uses of is that he went over on the bottom of 97 and the top of 98, the senses of is, they all have this sort of central core paradigmatic sense, which is, of course, the Greek sense that we talked about last time, the idea of being as coming to presence. Being as presence. Okay, and this is then where we essentially end this chapter. So this leads us to the third discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger's twofold claim that, one, being opens up for us in a manifold way, and yet, two, there is a definite unitary trait that all of these manifold senses share, namely the relation to the Greek conception of being as presence. What about this notion of being as presence makes the Western historical concept of being distinctive? What is the alternative to conceiving of being as presence? What distinctive consequences does this specific conception of being have? Is this a conception that should be embraced or criticized? So once again, third discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger's twofold claim that one, being opens up to us in a manifold way, and yet two, there is a definite unitary trait that all of these manifold senses share, namely the relation to the Greek conception of being as presence? What about this notion of being as presence makes the Western historical concept of being distinctive? What is the alternative to conceiving of being as presence? What distinctive consequences does this specific conception of being have? Is this a conception that should be embraced or criticized?